guys seem very quiet today. I'm just ready for the day to be over.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So, to finish up Prohibition, the last piece of the puzzle, or the last thing that we're going to talk about. So we worked our way through Prohibition, basically, that when we get towards the end of Prohibition, the last kind of step is that Prohibition gets so out of control, and especially not just Prohibition, but the organized crime that comes with Prohibition gets so out of control, from the bootleggers to the gangsters to the mafia, et cetera, that it feels almost impossible to stop, right? Well, we can't really talk, about organized crime, post-Prohibition without talking about one person in particular. So we're going to take just a couple of minutes to talk about, kind of a sidebar, basically, of this very influential person when it came to Prohibition era mafia, gangsters, et cetera, and that specific person is Al Capone. Okay. Again, a little side story or a little sidestep to our normal, regularly scheduled talks of Prohibition, but still influential above all other bootleggers, gangsters, et cetera, that we've talked about so far. So Al Capone is heavily regarded as like the baddest of the bad, right? That there has never been, at least in this era of 1920s gangster and mafioso type activities throughout, especially Chicago, New York, large cities, post-Prohibition, nobody has ever outdone him, okay? When it comes to Al Capone's quote unquote like resume, it looks a little something like this. We've got gang activity, obviously, from his deep ties into multiple Chicago mafia scenes, racketeering, which is basically just business fraud, like pretending to be something else, swindling people out of money, insurance fraud, et cetera, bribery of major politicians, which leads directly back to his Prohibition roots with trying to get alcohol smuggled in. Bootlegging, obviously going right along with it. Rape charges, 500 plus murders in his lifetime. And he earned about $60 million in 1920s money, and 700 men in his control selling illegal alcohol each year. So 60 million in 1920s money every year. So he was racking up the dough. Obviously from illegal purposes, but money's money. What's up, baby? So since he had like 700 people underneath him, he could basically pin it on somebody else very easily, or he could bribe his way out of it most of the time. Oh, he was like very well known in the communities. Al Capone was, like I said, 500 plus murders on his resume, but he's also the reason that we have expiration dates on milk. So people actually liked him.
Wait, what do you mean?
So the reason that we have expiration dates on milk is because there was a company in Chicago that was very well known for like not having fresh products. And one of Al Capone's like best friends got sick from spoiled milk one time and ended up dying. So he basically like put forth enough money to that company and to like the federal government to say, hey, you should start doing this. And then we started doing it. Because a friend of his got sick and died.
So he did a good thing?
Yeah. Yeah, Sean.
Was he caught selling it as well?
Selling what? Illegal alcohol? No, he was never caught for selling illegal alcohol. We'll talk about what he's actually captured for in just a second, but he is never caught for any of these things. Everything on his resume right here is nothing that he is charged for. Yeah.
Did he have a favorite film method?
I'm not sure. We're going to talk about one in particular instance that sticks out in history, but I don't know about anything in particular. All right, so, this is just a short list or a resume basically of Al Capone and why he comes out at the top of this mafia gangster pyramid, basically. But that is not to say that he is alone. There are a ton of other mafia bosses and people with very high influential status when it comes to bootlegging, speakeasies, et cetera, alongside of Al Capone that are going to make a difference or going to kind of run these towns. But Al Capone goes down as one of the best well-known, okay? One of the reasons that he is the best well-known is because of obviously the massive amounts of wealth that he has, but his background, is honestly not very long to be so well known. So he started off like this, he started building his resume at about 21, okay? And the reason he's so well known is because he is very, if there's competition, he doesn't let there be competition very long. We'll say it that way, okay? He was very well known, especially in the Chicago area, for targeting certain competitors when it came to bootlegging, speakeasies, or any other illegal activities that might be in his way. He operated a numerous amount of breweries in Chicago, which would then be speakeasies turned breweries, et cetera. 10,000 speakeasies across Chicago got their supply from Al Capone and his gang. By 1927, he was worth over $100 million. Probably more than that with everything that he had going on. But in 1931, he was finally captured, finally put in jail for tax evasion. He didn't pay his taxes.
Actually, that's how a lot of serial killers get caught too.
Yeah. That is the only convictable crime that they have ever been able to put on Al Capone was tax evasion.
How did they find out these other things?
They would arrest other people and they'd be like, yeah, I'm part of Al Capone's gang. So they attribute it to him. Afterwards, when he's finally caught and put in jail, he starts going insane basically, and they start asking him questions and they get a lot out of him. But by 1931, the only way that they could get him behind bars was for tax evasion. That's why you always pay your taxes, kids. Kyle?
How long was he?
Basically till the end of his life, about 6 more years.
He died.
Do you really want to know?
Yeah.
Syphilis.
Oh. That's a yikes.
Okay, I don't.
STDs. STDs are an infection, so
Yeah, no, I put the pieces.
there we go.
together.
There we go. We're good. Go ask Mrs. Box. That's a different class. So it's kind of an interesting end to somebody who was so well known and so kind of a badass bitch, but not a whole lot else to go for. Okay.
Did they have medication for?
Very little. Very little. We didn't even have the polio vaccine by the time he's in jail, so. All right, so, sorry, Brenda, did you have a question? No. I'm not gonna show you guys it because it's just a little bit over the top in terms of inappropriateness for school, but there is a drunk history about him and being captured and the syphilis. So if you guys ever want to watch it, you can. I just can't show it to you guys here. So Capone, by the time that he gets convicted in 1931, he's got that laundry list of things on his resume. The most influential or the most important thing that happened during his time in Chicago, basically at the height of his fame, was something that happened called the Valentines Day Massacre. And this is kind of like the sidestep, basically, of a really important event that happens during the 1920s. That starts to shed light on how big of a problem that this whole prohibition thing was. Things like this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for prohibition. And when we see, or the entire country sees that this has happened, it starts to shed a new light on, hey, maybe we should stop ignoring this. Maybe this is actually a problem that we need to address, okay? So the Valentine's Day Massacre was by far Capone's biggest sting operation, his biggest swindle against any of his competitors. The target at the time, or the target in question, was a guy named Bugs Moran. He was another very famous mafia boss. He was the leader of something called the North Side Gang of Chicago. And obviously he was Capone's #1 rival. He was Capone's rival in basically everything. Like, he also participated in bootlegging. He also participated in mafia wars, basically. He also participated in speakeasies, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. Everything that Capone did, Bugs Moran also did. So like I said earlier, Capone is not known for, or is actually, I should say, very well known for not letting his competitors get too far in the competition. So Bugs Moran is at the top of his hit list. Capone had set up this very elaborate plan, which involved his men posing as police officers to conduct a raid, quote unquote raid, that they had been tipped off about, that a shipment was coming in. So his men were dressed up as police officers to go in and say, hey, that shipment has bootleg alcohol. We're going to arrest you. And when they go in to arrest them, they basically line them up against the wall, say, put your hands behind your back. They take out machine guns, and they never saw it coming, okay? No problem at all. Capone, like we know, he was only evicted for tax evasion. He never stood trial for this crime, and he would have never been convicted anyway. He claimed that he was, quote, too unwell. He was in Florida. We're going to watch a video kind of highlighting that day, basically, of what happened with the Valentine's Day Massacre, why Capone is never, like, questioned or, you know, never taken into custody or anything like that. But I'll let you guys finish this up real quick. Like I said, this whole conversation about Al Capone and the Valentine's Day Massacre is kind of a sidestep to what we're talking about when it comes to prohibition. But it's important to note the cause and effect that comes with it. If we didn't ban alcohol, if prohibition was never passed, we wouldn't have had an increase or a substantial rise in organized crime. Al Capone probably wouldn't have been as publicly well known. He wouldn't have had as much competition, therefore no reason to kill off Bugs Moran, therefore no Valentine's Day Massacre, okay? So there's a lot of cause and effect when it comes to what we're talking about now and where we've been. All right. So like I said, we're gonna watch this short video. It's like 5-ish minutes long, something like that. You don't need to take notes over it. I really just need your attention when it comes to it. I will warn you that it's from a Ken Burns documentary, so they don't really have any what's the word I'm looking for? Censoring. So there's a couple of pictures of that's kind of gory. I just wanted to let you guys know, if you don't want to look, you don't have to look, but it's not that anything, it's not like you're gonna see somebody's head blown off, but there is like some after pictures, okay? Probably nothing you haven't seen before. Come on.
He really seemed to believe that he could be a family man and supply us booze and kill people when he had to, and still somehow come out of it all. Maybe it was naive, but the guy really seemed to think that he could pull it off.
On the morning of February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day, Al Capone was vacationing at the new villa he had bought on Palm Island off Miami Beach, Florida. Back in Chicago, the truce Capone had tried to impose on the city's bootlegging gangs had collapsed again. His chief rival was George Bugs Moran, the triggerman who had once almost killed Capone's mentor, Johnny Torrio, and had made a failed attempt on Capone's life as well. Moran loathed Capone and loved saying so to newspapermen. Capone was a beast and a behemoth, he said, lower than a snake's belly, because he dealt in flesh, prostitution, as well as beer. In Chicago that morning, according to one of many contradictory stories, Moran received a phone call. It was from a nameless hijacker who said he had a big stolen shipment of whiskey for sale. Moran told his caller to drive it to a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. He'd meet him there at 10:30. At the appointed time, 7 of Moran's men were waiting inside the garage for the hijacker to arrive. Moran himself was late. He had stopped for a haircut. Meanwhile, 4 men drove up in a Cadillac and hurried into the garage. 2 wore police uniforms. They all carried shotguns or submachine guns. They lined Moran's men up against the wall. Then they opened fire.
They're nice and bloody, a lot of photography, no investigation required. And who do you lay it on? Our favorite guy, Capone. Capone did this, despite the fact that he was in Florida.
It was extremely cold-blooded. Nobody knows to this day who did it. Nobody was ever arrested, nobody was ever charged with the crime. It was widely believed to have been the work of Al Capone, who was said to be in pursuit of Bugs Moran. Bugs Moran was not one of the 7 men killed.
No one could ever prove Capone was involved. The killers got away clean. Bugs Moran managed to hold on to his territory and what was left of his gang, but continued to feud bitterly with Capone. The Chicago American reported that Chicago gangsters graduated yesterday from murder to massacre. Something had to be done.
The Valentine's Day Massacre becomes a rallying point at which people say enough is enough. Something's got to be done about this. There have been other shootings where, half a dozen people have been killed before, but this one is different. It seemed ridiculous to people that after all these years, nobody had done anything about it. These gangsters can continue to operate with impunity. That Al Capone sitting in his mansion in Florida on the beach with a cigar in his mouth and a fishing rod poked into the water can order a hit and have 7 men taken out in Chicago and nobody would do anything about it, and he wasn't even arrested.
Gang violence was on the rise in nearly every American city.
Spraying this crowded street with lead at Dyckman Street and Broadway, 2 thugs who killed 2 policemen in cold blood met death in this bullet-riddled cab. The cab itself was hit 42 times in a running gunfight. Look at those bullet holes. The crowd, which a few minutes before fled in panic from the bandit's fire, pressed the police car in an attempt to see the dead bandit taken away. He goes to join his 2 companions, who died on the way to the hospital.
Slaughter was bad for business. Even the mobsters began to worry that things were getting out of hand. 2 of the shrewdest now lived in New York City. Capone's old employer, Johnny Torrio, and Meyer Lansky, who had already joined forces to organize the bootlegging and rum-running businesses from Boston to the Great Lakes. For 3 days in May of 1929, an unprecedented conclave of mob bosses from the eastern half of the country strolled together along the beach at Atlantic City, New Jersey. Johnny Torrio and Meyer Lansky were there. So were Charles King Solomon from Boston, Boo Boo Hop from Philadelphia, Kansas City's Johnny Lazia, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Dutch Schultz, and Albert Anastasia from New York. Together, they agreed to build a national crime syndicate.
They had finally a sit-down and said, we can't kill each other. And they divided up territories nationally using the Federal Reserve Bank's grid to figure out where the zones were.
Prohibition had been intended in part to reduce crime. Instead, it had provided small-time criminals with a world of opportunities to increase exponentially their profits and their power.
They learned during Prohibition how to do the things that they would need to do in the years ahead in every form of organized crime that we've seen since. How to control money, how to control troops, how to differ with each other, how to cooperate, how to end feuds. Prohibition was the finishing school, the college and the graduate school for the criminal syndicates in America.
Al Capone had attended the Atlantic City Summit too. It had been called in part because of the St. Valentines Day Massacre, which had brought so much unwanted attention. Afterwards, he told a reporter, "At Atlantic City, we all agreed to bury the past and forget warfare in the future, for the general good of all concerned." In Chicago, the general good usually meant what was good for Capone. His business was booming. Illegal beer was as plentiful as ever. No one, it seemed, could touch him. Each morning that spring, President Hoover and some of his officials exercised together on the White House lawn. The press called the group the Medicine Ball Cabinet. One day, as Hoover hurled the ball, he asked the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, "Have you got this fellow Capone yet? Remember now, I want that man Capone in jail."
So, eventually, Hoover will get him in jail. Andrew Mellon specifically will get him in jail. But we got a little bit ways to go before that. But like that video talked about, there is a clear-cut path, basically, from the passage of Prohibition and the rise of organized crime to where we are at, basically at that Atlantic City meeting where we have to tell all the gangsters, hey, stop killing each other. This is bad, okay? The fact that we have to even have that conversation is a true, direct, like, quote as to how much of a failure Prohibition is, okay? Which kind of leads us to the end of Prohibition. You know, if we look back at, 1919, 1920, when we are passing Prohibition and passing the 18th Amendment, we look back and we say, hey, this was probably not a good idea, okay? The 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, somewhat due to the fact because organized crime was so out of control, but also because during 1933, we are in the midst of the Great Depression. And you can tax the hell out of alcohol. So if we put alcohol back on the market, we'll get some revenue. So there's a multitude of different reasons that Prohibition is reinstated, or excuse me, that Prohibition is repealed. But one of which is basically we knew it was a failure from the start. Okay. By the time that it's repealed in 1933, it's almost too late. The organized crime became more advanced and had moved onward to dealing with drugs. Okay. So basically, all right, alcohol is not illegal anymore. You know what still is illegal? Cocaine, marijuana, heroin, okay? Drug cartels and drug empires from basically all across the world, or especially the ones that operate in the United States, have roots in the Prohibition era. That these mafias that had previously dealt with bootlegging and illegal alcohol had moved on to other illegal substances, and it's going to be a bad time for a long time. Okay? All right, so what questions can I answer for you guys about the end of Prohibition, Prohibition in general, where we go from here? Yeah, right. Kind of yes and no. So like the thing in Atlantic City happened and they basically all agreed like, hey, we're gonna stop killing each other. We're gonna stop like putting hits out on each other, right? That we're gonna be good to each other. So when Al Capone is put in jail, a lot of it is like seized by the government basically, because you're like, well, you're stealing from us, so we might as well take it back. Nobody really takes his place. That's not to say that the mafia wasn't alive and well for a really long time, but nobody was ever as like powerful or influential as Al Capone after he's put away. Yeah, Nora.
So Al Capone, did the officers and did the law enforcement have any suspicions that all of this was happening and Al Capone was going to be people?
Like when it came to the Valentines Day Massacre, or like just in general?
Anything, really? Did they have any suspicions that Al Capone was behind it?
Absolutely, but Al Capone had enough money to pay him off. Al Capone had so much money that I could look you in the face and go, if I was Al Capone, I could look you in the eyes and go, I just murdered 7 people. Take this $100,000, go deal with it, and don't talk to me again. He had that much money and that much power.
So he could just like throw money like that away.
Yeah. He could throw money like that away. He had so much power and influence because of bootlegging and speakeasies. Because remember when we talked about speakeasies a couple days ago, the sheriffs and the police officers and the senators and the commissioners all didn't like prohibition either. So they were just going to let him keep doing what he needed to do. And like I said, Capone did a lot of like good things for the community. So like the thing with the expiration dates on milk and other food, he also like created homeless shelters and like orphanages. So like it was hard to be mad at him sometimes.
Were the members of his gang, were they well treated or no?
Yeah. The higher up you went, the higher, like the better you were treated, but generally everybody was in a good spot if you were part of Capone's gang. Okay. I love the questions. I like talking about Al Capone. He's very interesting. His IQ was like 40. He was not a smart guy, and he made a lot of money. Huh?
Actually.
Yeah, actually. So like your average IQ test, or your average IQ should be around 100 because that's an even number. So like your IQ is based on your level versus your age. So 100 would mean you're at level. He was at like 40 or something. He was way below level when it came to IQ. You can't trust IQ tests all the time, but like way below level when it came to IQ, and he made so much money. All right. So let us go ahead and move on to the next piece of the puzzle, or the next place that we're going with this. We've gone through the 18th Amendment. Excuse me. So if we turn back time to like 1920, when the 18th Amendment is fully passed, prohibition is fully enforced. Thank you very much. When prohibition is fully enforced, we've got another problem on our hands, okay? We've got prohibition in the books. That's a win for especially like the temperance movement, which is made up of, like we talked about the other day, basically old white women. So these women, especially in the temperance movement, are looking at this and say, hey, look at what we did. We got prohibition passed. This is an awesome thing. And then literally the next fall, there's an election and they can't participate. So the next piece of the puzzle when it came to that large group of influential women is going and turning to suffrage. We're going to talk about suffrage next. Excuse me. And what I want you to do, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, and I want you to just talk with your elbow neighbor real quick, or just somebody around you, okay? I have a picture here from kind of the height of the suffrage movement before the 20th Amendment is passed, or excuse me, the 19th Amendment is passed. And I want you to take a look at this picture taken at a protest, basically, and think about those three questions on the side. So what do you see? What's physically going on? That's always the first question we have to ask ourselves. Around what year do you think this photograph was taken? And how do you think the public responded to something like this? So take like 2 or 3 minutes, talk to people around you about those questions, and then we'll come back, okay? All right. It sounds like conversation is kind of coming towards the downside, so we'll go ahead and come back together, okay? I just want you guys to be brave. I won't pick victims. I just want volunteers. Let's talk about the first question. What do you physically see going on here? Nora?
It's technically women's day. We were kind of mad at Germany for not being how we were, like for not being free to be communist. And then it's technically saying that women are controlled still.
Okay, so we have a woman here with a sign. The sign says, Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eyes. So we're recognizing that word Kaiser, and you've kind of put it together, and with the talk of Germany, that it's a German word, right? And that it's talking about how 20 million American women are not self-governed, okay? What else do we physically see happening here? Or is there anything else that we should be aware of that's physically being shown in this photograph? Okay. What year do you guys think that this photograph was taken? Trey? 1918, 1919, okay. Anybody else have a different opinion or a different year in mind? Yeah, Brendan. 1923, that's a very specific number. I like it, okay. 1923 on that one. Anybody else have a different idea? That was basically just a guessing question. You guys are really close. This was a picture taken in 1920. Super, super close. Okay. All right. How do you think the public would respond to a photo like this, or kind of the statement that's being made in the poster? Yeah.
Well, World War I ended, whatever, a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
something like that. I'm sure people aren't too happy with the Germans.
Okay.
So the public is not going to be happy that the Germans are trying to protest for their own rights.
Okay. So we are thinking, it's a little bit after the war. We're still not very happy with Germany. We might not be happy with any Germans protesting. Okay. So I want to flip the script just a little bit, just so we're aware. Who is Kaiser Wilson? Trey? And who is Woodrow Wilson? He's the president. So they're not necessarily talking about a German leader. They're making fun and like pressing the US president, Woodrow Wilson, for acting like a German, basically. So you guys are absolutely correct that like we're not very happy with Germany. We, see them still as very belligerent, like the enemy, right? So us comparing him, our own president, to the Kaiser of the German army or the Kaiser of the German government, it's kind of a low blow, right? We're being like, hey, you let Germany go, or Germany acts like this. Why are you acting like this? We're better than this. We're America. Okay. Most of the time, we're better than this. We're America. Okay. And then it says, take the beam out of your own eye. So basically, they're saying, Woodrow Wilson, you are blinded by your own ignorance, that we need to move forward, not backward. You are missing something here. Take the beam out of your own eye. Okay. Yeah, so not to retreat, just keep on pushing. That like you have to keep pushing for what you believe in, or have to keep fighting for what you believe in. And they're making that assumption, or they're making that connection to the German people as well. I like that. Okay. All right, so like I said, we are going to start talking about suffrage and the American women's suffrage movement. There are suffrage movements around the world, so we're focusing specifically on the American women's suffrage movement. And I just want to remind you basically what suffrage means. We've encountered this term before in US History A when we were talking about the right to vote for African Americans. Now we're revisiting it when it comes to women's right to vote. So suffrage, is just a reminder, is the right to vote, or we can use the term enfranchisement as well. We've seen all three of those used throughout either US History A or B in one way, shape, or form. So suffrage means the right to vote or enfranchisement. They all mean the same thing. All right, so, excuse me. When it comes to women's suffrage and when it comes to the women's right to vote, or trying to earn the right to vote, just like the prohibition movement and the temperance movement, it has been around for a very, very long time, up to this point where we saw this photo in 1920, okay? So the timeline of suffrage starts way, way back, and we're just gonna kind of move closer and closer to the turn of the 19th century, okay? Where it starts, or one of the biggest timeline pieces of our timeline of suffrage, happens in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. So more than 50 years ago at this point, way more like 70 years ago at this point, okay? From 1920, I should say. Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, they hold a conference, okay? In the early 1800s, a lot of women were involved in abolition, which is the anti-slavery movement, that African Americans should be freed, and the temperance movement. We just talked about this, the no alcohol movement, okay? So there's a lot of women, like I said, throughout basically the early 1800s up to 1850s or into the 1850s, that are very vocal about certain issues like abolition, temperance, among other things. The problem is, or that they are finding, is that although there is a massive amount of women and a massive majority of women who are participating in these types of groups, their voices are not being heard because of their quote unquote status as a minority in the United States. So there is a conference that is held by a lot of these different women in the abolition movement and the temperance movement that come together in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The leader of this conference, her name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and another woman, named Lucretia Mott, who both kind of organize the conference, get all the flyers out there, tell everybody to come, et cetera, okay? In the minds of women during this time, or at least in the mind of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the leaders of this conference, they were thinking that this conference was very, very similar to the congressional conference that they called before they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, okay? So in response to that, the women at this conference decided to get together and write something called the Declaration of Sentiments.
What is
The Declaration of Sentiments is basically like a letter, a newsletter, a statement that these women make in Seneca Falls, New York, talking about where they would like to see women in terms of their status, their space, et cetera, moving forward, and the different pressures, or I shouldn't say pressures, the different things that have been stripped away from them because of their status as women. Okay? We're gonna read through it together. That's kind of gonna be where we're heading with this. But the Declaration of Sentiments is another very purposeful primary source that we're gonna read through. That was written at this conference in Seneca Falls. Okay? Oh, I'm so sorry. All right. So in front of you, you have a copy of the Declaration of Sentiments. It's been kind of shortened down a little bit. It was like a 11-page long document. I don't want to torture you like that, okay? So it's been shortened down a little bit. And on the right-hand side, if you count down the lines, basically, if there's an underlined word or something like that, that gives you a little definition on the side of it just to make sure that everybody understands what's being read, okay? What I would like you to do, what would I like you to do? I want you guys to just go ahead and read it on your own. We won't read as a group, okay? I want you to read it on your own, excuse me, and think about these 4 questions while reading, okay? So as you're reading through this, I want you to think about these 4 things. Number 1, as you'll see, why did the women at Seneca Falls choose to copy the Declaration of Independence? You're gonna see very quickly that it's got a very similar structure. I want you to think about why. Number 2, what are 3 things that they complained about? What are 3 of the grievances that they feel are prevalent in basically, the women's day-to-day life? Number 3, are you surprised about any of these grievances? Do any of these seem kind of like out of the blue, or any of these, something like that? And then number 4, do any of these grievances or complaints seem like they're still true today? This one's entirely an opinion question, but I just want to see how you're feeling, okay? So what I want you to do is go ahead and read through that, and then we will come back together, let's say like 5 minutes or so. If we need less time, that's fine, but let's say about 5 minutes, and then we'll get back together and talk about these, okay? Yeah, we should be. All right. It sounds like most of you guys are at a point of that we finished reading it and we're ready to answer these questions together. So like I said, the Declaration of Sentiments was written at Seneca Falls together with all of the women in attendance. They basically, wrote this all together, signed it all together at the very end, and then they were using it as a platform to speak their truths, in which they decided upon at this convention, okay? So let's run through these questions real quick. Again, I'm not gonna ask for victims, I just want volunteers, okay? Why did the women at Seneca Falls choose to copy the Declaration of Independence? What do you think, Kyle? Oh, okay, so I'm copying it because when the actual Declaration of Independence was signed, they weren't able to be there. Okay, Aiden?
Maybe to be like, well, if all men were made the Declaration of Independence, then maybe we should make a similar one, but only by women.
Yeah, so Declaration of Independence, was made by men, basically for men. Maybe we should copy it and have something similar to a woman's perspective. Brian.
The Declaration of Independence says that their people are supposed to be free,
Yeah.
but in writing that in the future, they did not realize that only the people that they wanted to be free would be free in their society, that being white men.
Yeah.
And so as African American people began to earn their rights, women also wanted to earn their rights as a person, and not through gifts of a person.
So they recognize that there is discrepancies and they're trying to change it, basically. They recognize, especially like line 11, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. They're adding that piece because they realize that there's a discrepancy there, that there's something missing that should have been there in the first place, right? Emerson. Yeah, so the Declaration of Independence is obviously a big deal. It's one of our founding documents for the premise of this country. By emulating the Declaration of Independence, the women are saying, this is as important to us right now as it was when the Declaration of Independence was being written. Yeah. It's like a triple snap, right? Like you say it's the Declaration of Independence, but why are we having to write this again? Why are we having to put "and women" into this type of thing? You know what I mean? It's like a triple snap. Like, I don't think you quite got it right the first time. I like it. Okay. All right. So what are some of the things that they complained about? There's obviously more than 3, but let's just kind of run through some of the things that those grievances that they put out. Yeah, Aiden.
When it comes to church, they can be in subordinate positions.
Yeah, so I can no longer, when it comes to religion, women have to be in insubordinate positions. Okay, what else did they complain about? Josie. Not allowed to own your own property. I just bought a house a couple months ago. I wouldn't have been able to do that before that. Okay, what else, Ryan?
They have to pay for taxes, but they don't get to choose what the taxes are.
Yeah, I have to pay a whole bunch of taxes just like everybody else does, but I don't get to choose what the taxes get used to pay for. That's a huge part of like voting, right? And kind of putting out there what we want taxes to be used for. That's a huge part of it. What else is something that they complained about, or some of the grievances that they're talking about? There is a ton of them. Nora.
If they don't have an education and the husband decides like how much they want them to know.
Yeah, education is often like restricted when it comes to women. That there's only a certain level you can go to, and then basically a man makes a decision on when you should stop. Ryan.
Their husband is considered their master, and the women, the wives, are expected to be completely obedient to their husband.
Yeah. That the idea that the man has always been at the top and that man is master and women are subordinate to that. Okay. Just a couple of other ones that they talk about. Have never permitted her to exercise inalienable right of elective franchise, so they're not allowed to vote. Has withheld her vote or her rights when they are given most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. So basically that one, they're saying that you're treating us like natives and foreigners and slaves, basically. Deprived her of the first rights as a citizen, elective franchise, et cetera. Taken all her right and property, even the wages she earns. At one point, it talks about divorce and how like there is no way to ever get out of it, which is basically entrapment, which is slavery. They talk about depriving all her rights as a married woman, monopolizing all profitable employment, so women can't have jobs that are profitable, or women can't have jobs that are like can be helpful, right? Okay, so number 3, are we surprised by any of these grievances? Were there any of them that like kind of stood out to you, or are you just not surprised at all? Yeah, Ryan.
The only thing that surprises me is the fact that they do have to say these things.
Yeah. So like the grievances themselves, not very surprising. We obviously, I've said this a lot in this class, we have the benefit of hindsight that we can look back and say, yeah, that's how things used to be. So I'm not really surprised about the grievances. But like Ryan said, I'm surprised that they have to say it, right? That it has to be spoken aloud for it to be heard, that these things aren't just normal, okay? And this is true not only, this is written in 1948, so they're not necessarily just talking from a woman's perspective, they could be talking from an African American's perspective as well, that all of these things are still the same when it comes to the African American experience versus the woman's experience, and it's kind of ridiculous that we ask to be said, right? All right, number 4, do any of these grievances seem like they are still true today? This one's an interesting one. I want you guys to speak your piece if you have anything to say about it, but this one's kind of interesting. Ryan.
One of the biggest things is pay, like how much a woman gets paid compared to how much a man gets paid. To this day, a lot of the time women are not given the same opportunities for jobs. They're not paid the same. They're not treated the same in the workplace.
So have you guys ever heard of something called the glass ceiling? That a glass ceiling is only glass to some people, but some people are able to easily break through it. So in a lot of jobs, basically in corporate America, the glass ceiling doesn't exist for men, but the glass ceiling does exist for women, that it's very hard to break through the glass ceiling to get higher wages, to get a better position, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that does kind of commit to some of the things that are being said here. Nora, I think I saw you first.
The only thing that I can really think of is certain religions, the man is strictly the dominant, there's no say in that. So I don't think it really applies too much to us, but some men in some religions are forcefully dominant, and some things happen to women physically that way men can have more pleasure during things.
So there's a cultural difference that still exists, basically, because religion is part of cultural. Sometimes there's a cultural difference in how women and men are stacked up against each other when it comes to basically who is the dominant, who is the submissive. Yeah, Emerson. That there are, again, certain cultural things or certain moral things that are neglected because of the role a woman takes sometimes, okay? Again, that was just something I wanted to hear your guys' opinions about. Obviously, you didn't have to share if you didn't want to. I think that's a really powerful question, basically, to think about. Even if you go home and you're going through your backpack, recycling some things, whatever, and you look at this and think, man, what are some of the things that are the same here that are still kind of complaints and grievances that women have now? Maybe it's time to look at some of those things, right? Have a fantastic weekend. I will see you on Monday. Be safe, make good choices.
Thank you.
I'll see you then. Bye-bye. Thank you.
So I missed this class yesterday too. Is there anything I